Hello everyone, I'm Spinning Kong, and welcome back to my Oxygen Not Included in-depth series. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the basics of the process of converting crude oil into petroleum, and then finally all the way over to natural gas. Alright, let's get right into it. Crude oil is a naturally spawning resource. Typically you can find it at the base of your map in the magma biome, where it appears quite frequently in large cells. Typically it spawns between 800 to 1,000 kilograms per tile, although sometimes you can find naturally occurring spots with much higher pressures, well over 1,000 kilograms per tile. A word of caution, because the natural resting pressure of a tile of crude oil is somewhere between 800 and 900 kilograms per tile, even typical cells of crude oil are often under pressure, so when you dig into them, the crude oil can jump through the opening and start to flow into the area that you were digging in and can fill it quite rapidly. So always make sure to check how much pressure there is in a cell if you don't have dupes in Atmos suits. And because of the high temperature of the crude oil, here we can see some at nearly 200 degrees Celsius, it's very easy to cause duplicants to suffer severe burns and perhaps even be incapacitated. So if you're not using Atmos suits, make sure you have some medical buildings and you take a lot of care and plan out which cells you're going to go into. If you do have Atmos suits, as long as you're okay with the crude oil shooting out and it's not going to ruin your buildings, you're more or less good to go. All right. Besides the naturally spawning crude oil, the main way that I like to get my crude oil is by using oil reservoirs. If we go to, see here, our utilities tab and go to oil wells, we can see a building that's relatively inexpensive. It takes a little bit of power and 1 kilogram per second of regular water, and in exchange you get 3 1/3 kilograms per second of crude oil, so just over 3 times as much crude oil back out. This is actually quite a good amount of crude oil, and this amount of crude oil is enough to power a base almost to the ultra late game. For about 4 kilograms per second of crude oil, it's possible if you have access to some advanced materials such as supercoolant, thermium or niobium, you can make a structure that converts about 4 kilograms per second to at least 20 kilowatts of usable power constantly. Between 20 and 28 kilowatts of usable power constantly. And that is actually the structure that this series is beginning to lead to. So once I've explained the basics of all these conversions, I'm going to be continuing on that path with other videos until eventually I can show you how to build a structure similar to that. All right. There are some other ways to get crude oil into your base. The other most useful way of getting crude oil is by farming slicksters. They're critters that you can find in the world, especially over in the magma biome if you don't print them out from your printing pod. They feed on carbon dioxide and they will convert mass at a 50% efficiency. So if you feed them a kilogram of carbon dioxide, they'll give you back 500 grams of crude oil. And if you breed molten slicksters, you can get back 500 grams of petroleum instead, which saves you a step. All right. So once you have access to your crude oil, it's time to convert it into petroleum. The way that I would recommend for a later game base is to use heat to boil the crude oil, or rather vaporize the crude oil into petroleum. If you click on your crude oil and go to your properties tab, you can find that the vaporization point of crude oil is 399.9 degrees Celsius, or as I'm going to say, 400 degrees Celsius. However, although this is accurate, this is not actually the temperature at which the state change will occur. In Oxygen Not Included, to prevent effects like, say you had a tile of water that was at very close to 0 degrees Celsius, to prevent it from rapidly flickering between solid and liquid form, there's a buffer temperature that's required in order to spark a state change or an element change. So heating this up just past 400 degrees is not enough. Here we can see some crude oil that's too cold. Here's crude oil that's a little bit hotter. If I run the game, you can see that even at a degree hotter than the stated temperature, no state change occurs. To reliably induce a state change, you typically need to go about 2 to 3 degrees hotter. So here we have some petroleum that spawned once I got the temperature between 1.8 and 2.3 degrees hotter. However, some weird effects can happen. There are some unstable methods of heating that can potentially cause crude oil to, or any element really, to never go under a state change, even if you manage to heat it up to inordinately high temperatures. So for example, here I have some crude oil that is far beyond the temperature that it should be at in order to spark a state change. And if I go over to sandbox mode, and currently we can see the game is running. So keep an eye on this patch of crude oil over here. I can go to my heat gun, add some heat, and we can see that this crude oil converted into petroleum when I increase the heat. It wasn't enough to convert the entire batch. And even this crude oil that's at a higher temperature than this one was when it converted still hasn't finished converting. Yet this patch has not changed temperature at all. In fact, if I go back here and I continue to click, we can see that not only has this tile finished converting, but even I've raised the temperature enough to boil the petroleum into sour gas in both of these tiles, and yet this crude oil still hasn't changed state. And a large part of the reason why is because all of these tiles of crude oil are very similar in temperature. And according to the way that the heat mechanics work in this game, if two tiles have... there is a crude representation of thermal mass, or the total amount of heat energy that exists in tiles, and the game prevents heat transfer happening between two tiles that have a similar amount of total heat energy. This isn't actually the total temperature of the tile. It's more of a multiplication between the temperature itself and the specific heat capacity, which when you multiply them together gives you the actual amount of joules of energy being stored as heat, which has the weird side effect that it's possible to have, say, two tiles of different materials, one that's at a very low temperature and one that could be, say, 2000 degrees hotter. And if the difference in specific heat capacity is high enough and the difference in mass is just right, you can trick the game into thinking that they have the same temperature even when there's hundreds or thousands of degrees in difference in temperature. Again, those are very unstable situations. If you can very well isolate the systems and not let anything interfere, you keep them, you can make these situations happen in a regular survival game. However, it's very difficult to cause it to happen, and you need to be very careful to preserve it. So I haven't found too many uses for it, but I'll come out with a video later on that'll show some ways to potentially exploit these temperature mechanics. All right, so we have our crude oil. We've managed to convert it into petroleum by heating it past 400 degrees Celsius. Oh, and just to make clear the original point, if I were to go back here and spawn in some of the original superheated crude oil that would not change temperature and start the game, the whole thing changes state, because everything here was in thermal equilibrium at a much higher temperature, and when I introduced something at a very low temperature comparatively, heat was able to transfer between adjacent tiles, which then caused heat to transfer between the outer tiles, and the whole system collapses because it was unstable. So we've managed to convert our crude oil into petroleum. Next is to continue heating the petroleum up to just over 540 degrees Celsius. Doing so will cause the petroleum to undergo its first state change as well as element change, and it will boil into the gaseous sour gas. Sour gas is a material that's not particularly useful in and of itself. Petroleum is already an excellent end material. Once you reach petroleum, you can use it to generate other additional useful resources, such as polluted water and such as carbon dioxide. By burning it, it's useful for power generation, which I'll explain in just a moment. Sour gas is not, but it is the next step on the line to natural gas, which does all the same jobs as petroleum, but much better. So once you have sour gas, you need to then cool the sour gas to about minus 61.5 degrees Celsius. So that is a 700 degree drop in temperature, which makes changing from sour gas over to methane the most difficult step in converting crude oil to natural gas. There's an additional problem as well. When you do manage to convert sour gas into methane, which I can demonstrate here by painting some natural gas at a very low temperature, here 100 Kelvin, which is low enough for it to immediately liquefy into methane. In this case, it's going to liquefy and it's not going to stay in an unstable equilibrium because the manual airlocks will thermally interact with the sour gas, whereas it would not interact here because this is made of insulation. If I place this and allow the game to run, I might need to make it 90 Kelvin. Oh, I'm sorry. I made natural gas. What am I doing? Sour gas. There we are. All right. Sour gas liquefies. And we can see that not all of the methane or sour gas turns into methane. Most of it does, but some of it ends up on the floor in the form of sulfur. Sulfur is an unwanted at this point byproduct because there's nothing in the game that requires sulfur for its usage. It's an element just like any other. You can use it to make tiles, or rather trick the game to making tiles, similar to how you can cook dirt and force it to turn the fallen dirt into tiles. You can use it, you can liquefy it or carry it around your base, but it's not really necessary for anything, and it doesn't carry any particularly useful physical properties. I've never been building a structure in oxygen not included and wished that I had access to sulfur. It's just not remarkable in any way or necessary. So largely it's an unwanted byproduct. And unfortunately, the conversion from sour gas to methane causes about 1/3 of the mass of sour gas to convert into this largely useless sulfur. So you lose quite a lot of mass. And we can confirm that just by quickly mousing over here and doing some quick math. We can see here 1,020 kilograms of methane. Here we can see 1,010 kilograms of methane. Here's 1,000, and here's about 320. So if we add those up together, we get 3,050, I believe. Check, 20 more, 10 more, 0 more. Yep, 3,050. If we double that to make this out of 10,000 kilograms instead of the original 5,000 kilograms that we have for these 5 high column, we get 6,700 kilograms of material out of 10,000 kilograms, which makes 67% of the mass that was originally in this column is converted into sulfur, which means we're losing 33% as sulfur, which is 1/3. All right. There is another way to convert crude oil into petroleum that I think I should go over, which is using an oil refinery. So if I go over to my refinement tab, we can see that there's a building called an oil refinery that if we mouse over, takes just about 500 watts of power, which is not too much, and converts 10 kilograms per second, which is a full, or up to 10 kilograms per second, which is a full liquid pipe of crude oil, and gives you back half of that as petroleum. So 5 kilograms per second of petroleum. It also gives you a little bit of natural gas, which is just enough to pay for the energy cost of the oil refinery itself, and just a little bit more. However, while this oil refinery is an extremely simple and useful way of converting crude oil into petroleum when you don't have access to a system that will do this thermally, you're losing half of the mass of crude oil into petroleum, which means that converting the petroleum by burning no longer gives you enough water to make the system self-sustaining, which means you need to have an additional drain of water on your base. In addition, you're losing half of the power output because you're no longer able, well, you've thrown away half of your fuel. And finally, the oil refinery requires duplicate input, which means that your duplicants, instead of being able to build the system and just simply forget about it, will have to keep running back to the oil refinery and manually operating it, which is a lot less efficient. So very quickly, I like to try and transition away, or rather, I like to transition away quickly once I have the resources to build one of these converters. Typically, because you lose so much power from converting crude oil into petroleum, and because it takes so much duplicate time and effort, I just avoid using petroleum as a power source. until I have the resources to make one of these self-sustaining systems, and then only rely on the oil refineries for a short period of time while the system is building. Secondly, because I didn't mention it earlier when I was talking about the conversion from sour gas to methane, converting methane into natural gas is by far the easiest conversion you're going to do, because the condensation point from sour gas into methane is the same as the vaporization point of methane into natural gas. So your methane should be a little bit colder than the condensation point of minus 161.5 degrees. And once it's reached that temperature and its state changed over into methane, checking our natural gas tab, we see that the condensation point here is exactly the same temperature. So all you need to do is get past the threshold in the other direction, which means only heating up about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. So this is by far the easiest conversion. And again, like the previous cases except sour gas to methane, this is a 100% mass conversion. So this is the only point in the entire process where you lose usable mass. There is one additional property of these elements that I should probably elucidate, and that is the specific heat capacity, and more importantly, the change in specific heat capacity. So to explain what I'm talking about, if I click on the crude oil here and I go to its properties, we can see that it has a specific heat capacity of 1.690. And what that means is that it requires a certain amount of heat, in this case measured in kilodtus. So it requires 1.69 kilodtus, which is again a measurement of heat, in order to raise 1 kilogram of this material by 1 degree Celsius. Here it gives it in DTUs and grams of the material, but I prefer to think about it in kilodtus because kilograms is a much more standard unit. The number ends up being exactly the same. So whether you talk about grams, you talk about kilograms, it doesn't make very much difference as long as you're consistent with your units. So this is a pretty esoteric number. More practically, if there is a high specific heat capacity, so for example, if there was 20 kilodtus here, it requires a lot more heat to change the temperature of a material by the same amount. So for example, if I were to place a thermal aquatuner inside this pool of crude oil, running the thermal aquatuner will cause a consistent amount of energy, joules of heat or kilodtus, whichever you prefer, to enter into the pool. And this will slowly increase the temperature of this crude oil as long as the thermal aquatuner is running. If the crude oil has a high specific heat capacity, what that means is that it can absorb a lot of heat from the thermal aquatuner before it will increase its temperature. If it has a very low specific heat capacity, what it means is that it can absorb only a little bit of heat before its temperature increases. So practically speaking, what's important about this difference in specific heat is that every element increases its specific heat capacity as you go down the chain, which means it becomes more and more difficult to effect a change in temperature. So if we go from crude oil, which has 1.69 as its specific heat capacity, we can go to petroleum, which has a specific heat capacity of 1.76. It jumps again to 1.898 at sour gas, and then the most noticeable jump when you go to methane of 2.191. And finally, converting from methane to natural gas has no change in specific heat capacity. It stays at 2.191. So it's always non-decreasing and tends to increase. The big reason why I bring this up is because if you do use a system like this that, for instance, uses a thermal aquatuner to cool your materials, you could, for example, I'm not going to place any liquid in these pipes, so I'll build them just for clarity's sake. Oops. A simple way of converting crude oil into petroleum would be something like this. You have a pool of crude oil, you place a thermal aquatuner in it, the thermal aquatuner runs and begins to heat the crude oil, and at the same time, it provides the same amount of cooling power over to the petroleum. The crude oil continues to heat until eventually it goes above 400 degrees Celsius and it converts into petroleum. And when you're done, you can move all the petroleum over into this cooling tank. So if you have an equivalent amount of mass of crude oil on one side and petroleum on the other, and say you began with all the you would run this one cycle earlier. So this starts at, say, 60 degrees Celsius or something, and this is already at just above 540 degrees Celsius. You can heat this crude oil all the way up to 540 degrees Celsius, but this petroleum will not drop back down to 60 degrees because its specific heat capacity has increased. It takes more cooling power to decrease its temperature. Similarly, the same effect happens with the sour gas. So it takes more cooling power again to drop this temperature or to raise it. What this means is that special care needs to be taken with your systems to provide a little bit of extra heating or a little bit of extra cooling each time you want to produce a new element, because simply going from one element to the next is not going to be enough to bring it back to the original temperature. The ending temperature of whatever system you make is typically going to be a few degrees hotter than your starting temperature. So that's something you definitely need to watch out for. Once you're familiar with it and you know what to look for, it's not something that's very important. It rarely makes too much of a difference in terms of your builds. And in fact, this increase in specific heat capacity in more advanced builds using very low cost methods to actually make the conversions and save you a lot of power, the increase in specific heat capacity actually saves you energy and makes the systems even more efficient. So it's quite a good property to have. And if I could change it so that the specific heat capacity increased even more, at least from the perspective of somebody who wants to generate lots of power from crude oil, it would be a positive change. So what is the big difference between converting crude oil to petroleum versus going all the way over to natural gas? Converting just to petroleum is a relatively straightforward process. You don't need access to too much materials. It doesn't take too big of a converter. And you get power and some additional materials out of the conversion. If you go to your power tab and you check out your petroleum generator, you can see that by burning a combustible liquid, not necessarily petroleum, but in this case, we're going to use that. You can see that for 2 kilograms per second, you get 2 kilowatts of power. Or in other words, every kilogram of petroleum is worth 1 kilojoule of power. Instead, if we check for natural gas, we see that for every 90 grams, we get 800 watts of power. If we do some quick math, we find that for 1 kilogram of natural gas, instead of 1 kilojoule of power, we get 8 and 8/9 kilojoules. So approximately 9 times as much power comes from natural gas than petroleum, which makes this a vastly superior resource. Unfortunately, we lose 1/3 of that mass converting from sour gas to methane, but even still, we get approximately 6 times as much power from natural gas as compared to petroleum. Petroleum also gives you some reagents. So it gives you access to some carbon dioxide. 1/3 of the mass that you put into the petroleum generator comes back out as carbon dioxide, and 3/8 comes back as polluted water. However, if we check our natural gas generator and we do some quick maths again, we find that we get the same 1/4 carbon dioxide, but instead of 3/8 polluted water, we get 6/8 or 3/4 polluted water. Similarly, we lose, like to the last case, we lose 1/3 of that to the conversion from sour gas to methane. And so we end up actually losing some of the carbon dioxide we would have gotten, but we end up gaining in terms of the amount of polluted water. So as long as you're converting thermally and you're not using, say, an oil refinery to convert your crude oil into petroleum, for every kilogram of water that you put into an oil well, you get back 3 1/3 kilograms of crude oil, which if you convert over to petroleum and then burn it, will get you back 1 1/4 approximately kilograms of polluted water, which means that simply converting from crude oil to petroleum is enough to pay for the original water that you needed. So you don't need to worry about your base running out of water by powering a system like this that converts crude oil into petroleum, because it will pay for itself and then give you additional water that you can put back into your base. Similarly, converting all the way to natural gas will also give you polluted water, but in this case, it gives you 1.5 kilograms, which is a noticeable increase. Oh, pardon the birthday. once you reach past the point of not needing any additional water, having a little bit extra come out is not too big of a deal, but it is still nice. And I think that it more than makes up for the loss in carbon dioxide. Obviously, it depends on what your base needs. If you have large slickster farms, having a little bit of extra carbon dioxide will be more useful than water, which you should already have more than enough of. But for the most part, simply because of the increase in power, I would judge this as a massive increase in usefulness over petroleum. All right, so we've largely covered the basics of converting crude oil into both petroleum and natural gas. In some videos upcoming soon, I'm going to be going over specific methods of actually doing the converting, how I would build these structures into my base using things like thermal aquatuners, potentially natural resources such as magma and volcanoes. I'm going to be going over ways of passively changing heat from one element to another to prevent most of the resource costs. So for example, I'm going to be going over how to construct a radiator that will passively exchange heat between different elements. And I think we're in a good spot to head into the next video and explain more about how to do these conversions practically. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it's useful and you can get some good builds out of it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the description. If you liked, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe. And have a good day.